it's really a pleasure to be here. I met Neil 2 years ago at a writers' conference in Vermilion at the University of South Dakota, and wound up chatting with him by his pickup truck the night that it was over. And this spring, out of the blue, I got this email from him saying, "Hey, do you remember me? We met in Vermilion, and I'm putting together the reading series for the fall. How'd you like to come back to Nebraska and read?" And I thought, wow, I'd really like to do that. So it's really a pleasure for me. I love the Great Plains, even though I live near Seattle. But I've crisscrossed them many times. I used to sell Christmas trees in New York City, and I would drive all the way back. And so I've crisscrossed them quite a bit. And I've had a lifelong love affair with the American West, and I consider the Great Plains part of that. And so I've had a very enjoyable day here with Neil going around the local area. And I'm going to read primarily from the book, A Guest in All Your Houses. I'll sprinkle in a couple, 2-3 poems from a couple of other manuscripts that I have going, one international poems and the other more or less centered around the Pacific Northwest. I thought I would read for, 40, 45 minutes and then open it up to questions from you guys if you have any. So I think I'll start with the opening poem in the book, which is called Notes from a Sodbuster's Wife, Kansas, 1868. And in my driving across the plains over the years, one of the things that really kind of seeped into my consciousness was, what was it like, especially for women coming from the East Coast out into Kansas and Nebraska in the middle of the 19th century. So this is a persona poem in the voice of such a person. What really got us in the end, we women who didn't make it, who withered and blew away in the open, was the wind. Space, yes, and distance too, from neighbors, a piano back in Boston, but above all, the wind. In our letters, it shrieks hysteria from sod huts, vomits women prematurely undone by loneliness, boils up off the horizon to suck dry their desire as it flattened the stubborn grasses. Not convinced? Scan the photographs, grainy and sepia-toned like old leather. Study our bony forms in plain black dresses, our mouths drawn tight as a saddle cinch, accusation leaking from rudderless eyes, betrayed. I tried. Lord knows I tried. Survived the locusts and even snakes that fell from the ceiling at night, slithering between us in bed. I dreamed of water, chiffon, the smell of dead leaves banked against a rotting log. I heard opera, carriage wheels on cobblestone, cried and beat my fists raw into those earthen walls. The wind, even as it scoured the skin, it flayed the soul, that raked, pitted shell. And how like the Cheyenne, appearing, disappearing, no fixed location, not even a purpose one could name. Thank you. It's really nice to hear an audience. You know, you go to so many poetry readings and you read and there's kind of this broad agreement for some reason that you're supposed to be like a mummy in a museum until the very end. You know, whereas in musical performances, that's never the case. So I enjoy having the audience being involved. There was a grand old tradition in Elizabethan England where at the Globe Theatre, the people who came to see the plays could buy rotten tomatoes, and if they didn't like the actors, they could throw them on the stage. You're free to do that too. I hope it doesn't happen. But This next poem is a short piece from another area of the plains in eastern New Mexico, and it's called Messengers. Late night on the East New Mexico plains, a cheap sleeping bag pulled around me like a blanket. I twist and turn in the car. Whenever I doze off, they appear like buffalo coming down from the panhandle and trample my embryonic dreams. The ground shakes and rumbles. They rush past. Then silence, the cold breath of darkness. And just below the skin, an imprint, like a residue of warm ash. Freight trains, heavy in the belly, moving. This next poem would have been in the book had I written it before the book came out, but that wasn't the case, so it's going to go into what is essentially the Northwest manuscript, and I'm sort of stretching the definition of Northwest to include South Dakota in this case. When I was at the Milton Conference, Brian Bedard, the longtime editor of the South Dakota Review, as well as Neil, recommended that I visit a place 6 miles out of town called Spirit Mound, where Lewis and Clark had actually stopped on their way west. And I did that. I went out there and was just kind of entranced by the place and started taking a bunch of notes. And so this is the poem that resulted from that. Begin with the naming of things. Prairie, from French via the vulgar Latin praetaria, and further back to the Latin pratum, meaning meadow. And the mound itself, called by geologists a roche montanée, a bedrock knob shaped but not leveled by the last Pleistocene glacier. But long before these names, known to the Omaha, Oto, and Yankton Lakota as Pahawakan, an evil place inhabited by humans 18 inches high, who, according to legend, killed anyone in range with tiny arrows. Then profile the prairie itself, tall rather than short grass, and a century after pioneers ground it under for corn, whisper a word gashed by their plow, ecosystem, from the Greek oikos, house. This, then, is the house I wander, this small island with roots up to 9 feet down, surrounded by a cultivated sea, each plant a separate room in which the naming practice blossoms. Here are blue stem and side oats grama, wild bergamots, oxeye and milk vetch, the gray-headed coneflower, cordgrass, Indian grass, goldenrod, and Panicum virgatum. When I reach the top, I bite into my apple and face west. Isn't that what Lewis and Clark did when they climbed this hill of Niobrara chalk? West, where the sun kindles rebirth, like this site, seeded, then restored to what the explorers saw on their walk through Dakota country. Except for the wound that won't close. From the mound, they counted more than 800 buffalo and elk. This morning, bison is missing, vanished from the oikos, the house whose door, dangling from one remaining hinge, clatters against its wind-blown frame. Thank you. Whenever I come to the plains, and actually in many places that I've been, there's always a sense not only of what is there in the present, but what was there and kind of lingers as a ghostly presence. I'm going to read a poem from my international manuscript now, and this is called Breakfast in Baja, and it was written for a poet friend of mine, Russell Salomon. Restaurant Jalisco, the sign read, a 2-room adobe hovel sticking up like a wart from the desert floor. No, you said, it's too funky. We'll get something nobody's got a cure for. But we went in anyway to the little patio with its lone table covered with sand, which the old man's wife swept away with her hand before she took our order. You didn't want anything, but she misunderstood and brought out 2 plates of eggs and beans and tortillas, which we had to eat or insult them and slink away like whipped dogs. And you grudgingly conceded how good it was while she kept bringing more plates of tortillas without us saying a word, and avocados, and the chickens ran by from the garden. And the 3 kids kept trying to get the radio to work by beating on it with a hammer. And the old man went about his chores, hauling buckets of water back and forth, the 2 meals coming to about $1.75. Do you remember, my friend, how that breakfast lasted all the way to San Felipe, where the pelicans flocked to greet us? Thanks. I'm going to return to the book now and read a poem based on finding a place to camp at night in Utah on one of those trips east to New York. I wish I could have stayed in this little place in Utah instead of having to go to New York, but it didn't work out that way. And there's a reference in this poem to Belshazzar, who was the Babylonian king who summoned Daniel to interpret the strange writing on the wall of his palace, which foretold his demise. So this is called Forest Camp, Pavant Range, Utah. From up here, I could summon wolves to circle my sleeping bag. I could call down the moon on my tongue. The sun on the red cliffs behind me, the stream roaring through rabbit brush while cottonwoods dance in the wind. These tell me, like the handwriting that condemned Belshazzar, that I have been judged and found wanting. I must stay here, in mind if not in body. I must cultivate the heart of a whisper of the artichoke buried in spines. It's late in the harvest season, and I must gather enough of me up to make it through the winter. Hey, you guys are great. Can I take you back to the West Coast with me? Just on loan, you know. This poem is called Glenda, and it's very self-explanatory, so I'll just launch into it. You could tell she'd been around, scuffled for years in bars all over Colorado looking for that one breakthrough gig. Something in the eyes, a wariness, a frayed hunger that said, hold it, thorns grow here, and you might trip over the scars. But that was for everyday life. After the slick harmonizing duo sat down to normal applause, she climbed on stage and let us have it. Her rough, smoky voice, a scorched earth policy that destroyed whole villages and made us want to eat steak raw and have mistresses and die from orgasm in a nest of tropical vines. Woo! Outside, high in the Rockies, snow was melting. Why she hadn't made it was one of those mysteries, the disappearance of the Maya, the backside of the moon. You had to catch her in the moment, a meteor from the night desert floor. You had to be looking for it. Dark water, darker earth. One of my very favorite places in the world is northern New Mexico, and it's not for nothing that the state license plate says Land of Enchantment, and those of you who have been there can understand that there's something about that cultural overlay of Spanish and Native American. Forget about the Anglos, but just even that, which is marvelous. This poem was my impression of that area. It's called Mestiza, which some of you know is Spanish for a female of mixed Spanish and Indian blood. And there's a couple of other Spanish expressions in the poem. A ristra, which is those long dangling clusters of chili peppers that you see in northern Mexico. And then the expression te amo, me encanta, which means I love you, you enchant me. So this is Mestiza. On the high road to Taos, scattered among the weeds of Chimayo, the woods of Truchas and Las Trampas, memories of invaders drift through scrub oak, gutting the sacred circle, numbing with an iron sleep the sound of the white bone ringing. A new language flutters and swirls on wind that stings like a knife. Genesis of future names mingled with corn and baked earth. Rio Grande, Española, Santa Fe. Even the mountains congregating under winter clouds like prisoners waiting to be sentenced bear the mark of their passing. El sangre de Cristo, the blood of Christ range. The image lying open on their flanks as wounds on the hushed Indian tongue. And you, shadowy Isabella, what are you but the fruit, the graft that took, the blossom born of this naming? Daughter of two cultures, of Juan Gomez the cobbler, of soldiers and defrocked priests who branded the native mind no less than flesh with words that streaked like charcoal. Of trim-bearded governors, muleteers from Mexico, of Pueblo and Anasazi and Pinon pine. I look for you where wagon wheels lean against whitewashed adobe, under clusters of chilies, those flaming ristras hung from beams along the roadside. As I walk among juniper berries of bluish silver dusted with snow, I mouth an incantation, summon the dark eagle from your shawl. Pierced by his talons, I offer my wrist for the copper bracelet wound around your dreams, the flower white as the freshly dead that graces your hair. The elusive glance, the thoughts clothed in whispers, the evasions of a downcast eye, evoke muted guitars from the patios. A woman who kneads blood and clay, plants lavender under her breath. This language of ancestors softer than breasts over which syllables flow like mezcal. Te amo, me encanta. The bird says, not now, and is gone. The only sound is the wind. This was always an empty country. This is a very different kind of a poem. It's called Elk, and there's an epigraph to it. If you're hungry, eat an environmentalist. Sign on the door of the M&J Cafe in Alpine, Arizona. You hunting elk? A plumbing contractor sipping coffee at the counter points at the crowded tables. It's all hunters here, he says. I nod, hoping the feathers dangling from my hat don't brand me. I've just come over from Sedona. Hunters here, vortices and crystals there. Paleolithic grunge meets meditative flute, and who knows what twisted spawn will emerge, bloody and wailing as the crows descend. He must think I'm something new in the world, a synthesis yet to be defined. Undercover, maybe a new age hunter. After he laments the stress of climbing up and down cliffs all day, I give him my sports section as a sign of brotherhood. Next morning at dawn, I spot an elk crossing the road near Luna, New Mexico. Then more than 3 dozen of them, an entire herd parading north. One by one, they approach a fence that stretches towards some woods and float over it before bounding into the next field on hooves of polished stone. For a long time after the dark lifts, I hear them bugle, the shrill sound rolling over the valley like the crack of distant rifles. Thanks. I'm going to read a poem now that's part of the Northwest manuscript and takes place right where I live. I live in a mobile home park 20 miles south of Seattle up against a river called the Green. And when you walk the levee on a clear day, and we do have them every once in a while, you can look through gaps in the trees, and especially in winter and in spring, just a magnificent view of Mount Rainier, completely snow-covered. So this is a poem I wrote in the fall, a couple of years ago, called The Convocation of Crows. When I leave the house this morning, crows are looting the pumpkin field across Green River. Nothing remains of the corpulent gourds harvested earlier this fall. But scavengers can always find treasure among the leavings, coin in random scraps of straw. I confess to a love affair with crows, those carbon opportunists eager to sell us our own dreams. You have to respect a creature so brazen he merits the snow petal a showery gust pries loose. Reminds your tongue its home lies downstream towards salt water. Not so long ago, farms filled this valley. Now the crows skim warehouses and rows of corporate office buildings. The split kingdom of the riverbanks guarded by maple and giant alder, thickets of blackberries at war with upstart morning glory. This is sanctuary, raw scripture of rain. Driving past the pumpkin field, I listened to Coltrane blow silky gold, his horn flared deep autumn. Mount Rainier rises sotto voce above a gossamer layer of fog. After a storm, prevailing winds spirit the clouds east. What remains is new. What shine are bramble and slug, pearl. About a year and a half ago, I was driving back from Reno, where I'd been working for a couple of weeks, and I stopped in a bookstore in Oregon where I had done a reading, and I thought, I should buy a book from the bookstore owner because it's a tough go in this economy to keep a bookstore going, especially where she lives, which is on the road to Mount Hood in Oregon. It's not very heavily populated. So my eyes fell on this book called Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon. And I thought, that looks interesting, and I bought it. And it opened up a whole episode in American history that I've been completely unaware of. Specifically, it details the massacre of over 30 Chinese gold miners in 1887 in Hell's Canyon by a gang of horse thieves, which included a couple of teenagers, none of whom was ever punished for the crime. And for the last 4 years, there's been a Chinese Remembering Conference held in Lewiston, Idaho. And I went to that earlier this summer, and that's when I went on a jet boat up to Snake River, about 65 miles, to the actual massacre site, where they had an actual Chinese healing ceremony, traditional Chinese healing ceremony. Anyway, I wound up writing a series of poems based on this whole episode, and I thought I would read one of those now. It's called Skull, and was published right here in Nebraska, I'm happy to say. And it's addressed to one of the miners whose name was Che Po. Long after the flesh had vanished, a sheep herder found it at Deep Creek. It belonged to one of the Chinese miners massacred for gold in Hell's Canyon. A bullet had blown a whole section away, but this did not discourage the sheep herder from turning it into a sugar bowl. The sort of relic one might find in a collectibles store or the dusty, web-framed attic of an eccentric who died of cumulative failure. Was it you, Che Po, who contained this sweetness, held its promise? I like to think you weren't one of the bodies washed up downstream after weeks in the river, that you remained on a gravel bar where you'd panned for flakes, watched by bighorn sheep. It is important for me, a stranger writing 123 years after the murders, to imagine you there. More than artifact the morning light reveals, for whom water speaks a lost language. I'm going to bounce back to the book now. The book's divided into 3 sections. The first kind of roams around from Kansas and Colorado to Nevada, Utah, and the Eastern Oregon desert. And the second part is entirely based in Arizona and New Mexico. And the third part is set in the Big Bend of West Texas, where I spent 9 winters. I would leave New York after selling Christmas trees, and I would immediately go as far south as fast as I could to get warm again. And so I spent 9 winters in this quirky little community called Terlingua, which is about 5 or 6 miles from the entrance to Big Bend National Park, and almost right on the Rio Grande. And I think it was the second winter I was there, I went to a dance in a small community called Lajitas, about 12 miles upriver. There must have been 100 people at this dance. A whole bunch of Mexicans came across the river. And I wound up dancing with this woman for 20 minutes, became totally enchanted, and then the band stopped playing and she drove back to Austin and I never saw her again. So all I got out of it was some poetry, which I guess is okay. Anyway, I'll read a poem or two about that. This is called Satori. That night in Lajitas, I saw all we are given to see. In your veins, domed cities, empires, and in your face, dawn over Machu Picchu. Was that a guitar where your teeth, like Lorca's poems, flashed diamond bits toward Mexico? I heard gypsies shape the moon, and your hips bring languid rhythms of the silk trade. It was all so clear, the way Vermeer's blues and yellows defined the very sound of color. That's why this distance now, with no way to reach you, rumbles like thunderheads that threaten but bring no rain, no rain. Thank you. The book is dedicated to 2 people. One was a woman who was a founder of a writing group in Los Angeles that I was a member of for some years. And the other was a Spanish artist from Madrid whom I met in Terlingua named Miguel Arguello. And every winter, Miguel and his wife Natasha, who was from Mexico City, would come out there to paint, and I would show up there to write. And we became very good friends. And Miguel died in 2006, which is of cancer of the tongue, which is the last year that I've been to Terlingua. And so there are several poems in here that are addressed to him. And I'll read a couple of those. This one is called Night Hike, Chihuahuan Desert. You look savage tonight, Miguel, like Cabeza de Vaca wandering the southwest, or a Spanish Apache melting away in the moonlight. Stripped to shorts and sandals, a bandana around your head, you lead me through a ghostly landscape, ascetic, as you were in a former life, a sallow friar, conquistador turned artist with a brush of velvet steel. Hour after hour, we walk nearly naked among greasewood and mesquite, the ground-hugging dog Choya waiting to impale us. This is when it's best, the two of us alone on this ancient seabed, moving like a fossil dream, the stillness as close as will ever come to a numinous center. This is what I carry when the raven steals my sleep, the seed I plant among swords. What the ocean that once frothed here left, we inhale, and what we leave, neither snake nor javelina know. A javelina, for those of you who have never seen one, is it's basically a wild pig, and they're common down in that country. And this other one for Miguel is called Pallet. Except for shrubs beginning to erase the track carved out by your camper, the mesa remains the same. The penetrating smell of greasewood, dead ocotillo beside the fire pit, the creek a silver thread below. Nothing touched. As if you'd taken a few days off to visit friends or scout a new painting site. Art was breath and flow and the gift of a good rain. Let others pitch horseshoes and drink. You had to peel back the sky. I heard about it from Chris, cancer of the tongue, wasting away to 100 pounds in Mexico City. Your wife never called me, never wrote. Shame, someone said. She felt shame. Maybe it was the two small children you left behind, a Mustang bucking his image from the moon. No surprise you wound up there. You didn't like Mexico, yet you married a Mexican woman. To atone for Cortez, that dreadful rain. I confess, amigo, you were at times a thorn that scratched the skin. The fussy demands, the blind spots baffling in one so wise, evoked my father's vice-regal face. I know all about heavenly bodies, the planets that revolve around them, why the peregrine rules the heights, and the candle in the window melting a circle of frosted glass. But that means nothing now. The day sifts through my fingers as I wait for the sun to drop, for the play of light and color on the bentonite hills we hiked, for that deepening shade that accompanies a focus so sharp the land seems quick as thought, a talon poised to capture. Thank you. You guys are okay, you know that? This is called Potter Shop, Taos Pueblo. You enter to the sound of Black Magic Woman spilling from a cheap stereo, a song you can never hear without recalling Seattle's Blue Moon Tavern, 1971. Carlos Santana on the jukebox just before you left for Texas to look up a Brazos River Bottom's Guitar Hero. Cigarette smoke mingles with smudged sticks of sage and cedar tightly bound, their aroma frost from a horse's lungs. She streaks the days with delicate lines, a rain shower, perhaps, or a cattail marsh. But the design hardly matters. It's as if she's painting you instead, creating you stroke by stroke, limb by limb, until you emerge from the mirror, seeing yourself for the first time. Under her brush, you drift like a turkey vulture on its lazy scout above a corn dance, raven bride, creek water ceremony, trailing smoke threads behind. Imagine the Pueblo as a pumpkin etched by snow, a sash of flakes binding your lover to the moon. A murmur surrounds your hands as they lift a vase from the shelf, your hands and the vase and the creek and the sage. Not so much sound as rhythm, vocable of trees awash in wind time. When you turn the vase around, something inside you turns with it, wants to come out. Isn't it the sense of belonging that inhabits adobe, a tribal resin that coheres? Praise the bloom-splitting bone, the root tangled in marrow. Hands grafted to ceramic become branches of walnut. Dipped in cloud, your fingers trace the covenant that demands you pay the flute player, brave the riddle of breath. I knew a girl in the Big Bend who lived in absolutely the funkiest looking bus I've ever seen in my life. I was totally enchanted with it. So I wrote a poem for her. There's a couple of other Spanish words here. A ramada, which is an unwalled arbor for shade. And bosque, which means a forest or woods. And mandalas, which of course are those religious symbols in Hinduism and Buddhism. And in the last line, the word cache, spelled C-A-C-H-E, to store something, usually underground. This is called Kali. Each time I see her bus, I want to abandon everything and move right in. Flat tires fused to the ground like adobe, the ramada a cloak of weathered tin propped against it for shade. Rusted and soldered with miles, this wreck looms lovely as night bones sworn to testify. Even smoke wisps from the wood stove cast illusion. Heat's promise on cold winter mornings with no draft left to steal it. 16 years she's lived here by the river and thickets of salt cedar, a transplant who survives by painting hubcaps with mandalas. Metal discs line her cactus garden like outsized coins of the realm, mirrors of impossible silver in which stories always change their shape. What those spheres contain, abusive lovers, a fretboard laminated with moonfire, stains their surface like oil. Like human genes, no two can ever be the same. It's not so much she who brings the images to life, she would tell you, as the client seeding her brush with his pollen, a blueprint fashioned from willow and blood when the sun goes dark. Down in the tangle of the bosque, snakes lie deep in their dens. Benign in frost season, they do not hear her gather mist off the river, cache old memories in mud. Thank you. I'm going to read 3 more and then just open the floor. So I'll read one more from the Big Bend section. If I can find it. This is called Maverick. And there's another Spanish word, jacal, which just means a rude hut or shelter. There was a magic about that first winter, a convergence of energies that swept the desert like a blood oath, never to return the same way again. Playing music in bars drew invitations for rafting trips through the canyons, Texas on one side, Mexico on the other, while gypsy moths flitted in your path. the woman with dinosaur bones built into her fireplace, a drug lord's mistress, people who lived in buses, caves, dynamite shacks, jacalas made of ocotillo and cattle panel. Their lives reinvented, cobbled together from old spare parts and whatever they could scrounge. Surprise was the rain falling from a dream you nourished, a fragrance that chipped and flaked like a chisel dug up from the Stone Age. Here was no cop, no stoplight, and the wind forecast your future, told all you needed to know. Okay, and the next to the last poem is from the first section. It's called In the Crosshairs, Comanche National Grassland, which is not too far from Nebraska. Fire sears the air this morning. In my friend Katie's poems, the autumn colors twinges in my throat and jaw. When cancer struck at 25, it bore no pain, gave no warning. Do I now, so many years later, harbor malignant seeds instead of geese on the wing? Surely the truth lies elsewhere. In the cottonwoods, for example, that line the Purgatoire River, the blazing of their gold against the white peaks, a climax fever my bones inherit as kindling flares to match. Or in the blueberry muffins Katie baked with flax flour, how butter and steaming crumb-filled texture melting on the tongue felt almost too sensual, like an itch when the blood's inflamed. Then again, what of this ember glowing deep within the marrow, this coal that scores even the most resistant wood with blackened grooves? There is the need to get things down, to leave a mark, an imprint, some sign that validates a life. This is what the cottonwoods demand, these stunted prairie grasses. A voice that insists, that announces to no one in particular, "Ah, Consuelo, mi vida, I was here, I sang your song." Thank you, and I'm going to finish with a short poem from which the title of the book derives. It's really been a pleasure to be here. You guys have been a great audience. Really, really enjoyed it. So thank you, and thank Neil and the college. I appreciate it very much. This is called Driving North Toward the Hopi Reservation. So open this land, even the fences along the road sing their freedom. Fillets of earth lie exposed like salmon flesh torn apart by bears. The earth says, my grasses sweep away to horizons like the sea. And the buttes say, from my heights, you can see beyond the horizons. And the sky says, I rule the earth and I have no horizons. And I say, I am the wind. I will be a guest in all your houses. Thank you very much. So, your turn. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned through writing at the Spirit Mound, that one book, what was the name of that poem?
It's called Spirit Mound. Yeah.
I really liked it.
Thank you.
Where was that in South Dakota?
I beg your pardon?
Where was that?
It's 6 miles north of Vermilion, South Dakota, and it appeared in not the most recent issue, but the issue before that of the North American Review.
North American
Review. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've enjoyed your course.
Other questions? Yeah.
I can't think of a question, but I sure liked your where you took it.
Oh, thank you. That's extremely gratifying to hear. I think any writer, well, any artist, doesn't matter, musician, writer, painter, sculptor, they want to take somebody someplace hopefully a good place.
It was an eternal moment, kind of, that we all could feel if we are there with you, with the
Yeah, yeah, great. Any others?
So what inspired you to write?
What inspired me to write?
Exactly.
Exactly?
Yeah.
I was desperate. I wanted some kind of a creative outlet. And the idea of carrying a pen in my pocket and a notepad seemed pretty easy. I didn't know how to play piano. I didn't have any drawing or painting skill. But I was drawn to literature, and I pretty much just kind of dabbled for 2 decades or more. I was busy with a lot of other things, but around the beginning of the 90s, I started to get serious about it, and I had been in this writing group in LA for a little while, and the woman who founded it suggested one day that I read Robert Bly's book of essays, American Poetry, Wildness and Domesticity. So I bought it and read it, and it was a pivotal turning point for me. There's one essay in there in particular that he wrote in 1963 called "A Wrong Turn in American Poetry," and his thesis was that the influence of Pound and Eliot and William Carlos Williams and others had concentrated more and more on the objective physical world and not enough on the interior universe that you find in poets like Lorca and Rilke and Neruda and others. And to bolster his premise, he took absolutely the most pedestrian examples of English language poetry you can imagine, and contrasted him with these wild leaps of imagery and so forth that you find in Spanish language poets. I mean, both are valid, but for me it was nothing short of electric. I went back and reread Lorca, whom I hadn't read in over 20 years, and read a bunch of Neruda, and it just opened up a universe and a way of looking at creating poetry with more of an inner resonance, I suppose, than I had been consciously aware of before. So that and the 10 years I've spent going to the workshop in central Mexico have been the 2 most pivotal experiences for me in that regard. But I write because I think anybody who's serious about it, whether they're writing or composing or painting, they do it because they have an inner necessity. There's something that they feel incomplete unless they're creating beauty. Okay. Yes.
I noticed that you're very observant, and I was so amazed by how you observe everything, and yet, so it's kind of like the 5 senses, but then, like Bob said, an eternal moment or higher spiritual understanding comes out of that, and you capture the 2 together, which is really awesome.
Thank you. I'm very gratified that you mentioned that, because that is very definitely a central focus of mine, and I find that for me anyway, everything I write, it starts with an actual physical universe location, some kind of grounding that I myself and the reader or listener can get a foothold in. And that's a takeoff point to go places. So I very much appreciate your perception of that.
Now, you took me places as well as Bob. I guess we went places with him.
Great. Great.
That was great.
Thank you.
Speaking of places, where did you grow up? What was your, what were you, are you familiar with the Spanish language from way back when?
When I was in the 7th grade, well, to answer your first question, I almost hate to admit this, but I was born in Flushing, New York. I used to tell my mother the best thing that she and my father ever did for me was move west when I was 5. So, yeah, we arrived in Seattle in 1947, long before it had developed into what it is today. I mean, it was just a backwoods town dominated by Boeing aircraft at the time. And I grew up a couple of blocks from Puget Sound and the railroad tracks. My really very early influences were the natural world around me. And it really is very present there. And the reading I did as a kid, I was very, very fortunate. I belonged to the last generation that grew up at least partially without television. And I never could have even, my wildest imagination could never have conceived of, texting and cell phones and all of that when I was growing up. But my mother had a set of books that was published in 1921. It was a 12-volume series for young readers, and it had these condensed versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey and Chaucer and Robin Hood, and I mean, I just was totally enchanted with that. And my favorite thing to do, other than being outside, was to lie in bed on a weekend when I didn't have to be in school during a really heavy downpour, and read Norse mythology, which is my favorite mythology because it's the only one where the gods were vulnerable. Somehow that kind of, evened the odds a little bit. So I grew up there. And yeah, was there another part of the question here?
It was about Spanish.
The Spanish, yeah. Amazingly, when I was in the 7th grade, which I guess, I don't know, it was around 1955 or something like that, my junior high school offered Spanish class, and I took it. I took it all the way through high school and into college, and then I didn't use it for 25 years. And in 1990, I spent 7 weeks in Ecuador and Peru, and had to start kind of rehabilitating it. And I was, in the early 90s, I was living in Los Angeles, and I worked in an art publication company with a Peruvian guy who didn't speak English, so I had to speak Spanish with him. And then in the late 90s, I started going to Mexico, and I've been going to Mexico every year. So I found that the basic foundation of the language, set all the way back in the late 50s, was still there, and I could I could go from there. So that's where that comes from.
Would you prefer being in Mexico or Mexico, St. Taos, or?
Well, boy, that's an impossible question to answer. There's so many places that have had a resonance for me. Northern New Mexico is one of them. Parts of Mexico, Greece, which in the 60s was a real touchstone place for me.
Same kind of light.
Yes, same kind of light, exactly. So, I guess it depends on, what I'm doing and what particular part in my life in that regard. Anybody else? Going once, going twice?
So is there a lot of money in Christmas trees?
Is there what?
I've been joking. I'd say is there a lot of money in Christmas trees?
Oh, in Christmas trees. There was sufficient money in Christmas trees. But I did it for 18 Decembers, and it was strenuous. You drive all the way across the country. you're on the street in the middle of Manhattan 12 hours every day. And my tree location was on 2nd Avenue, which has to be one of the noisiest streets in the universe. All the truck traffic from New England would come into New York down 2nd Avenue. And you're out there in all kinds of conditions. I remember in 1989, 3 days after the season started, this Arctic cold front moved down from Canada and sat there the entire month. And I would be walking up and down the sidewalk at night with 9 layers of clothing on, with a wind chill factor of 10 below 0. So I don't miss that.
So are we to imagine you driving across the country with what?
No. Somebody else ran the business. Somebody back there.
Was it trees from out west?
Some of them, most of them were actually from Nova Scotia. And there were some from North Carolina, some from Oregon, but mainly from Eastern Canada. And but it really gave me an opportunity to see a lot of the country. And of course, in New York, you meet people from all over the world. That was the fun part. It was selling trees to people from every country you can imagine.
Well, it's kind of nice. It's fun. It seemed like it was people who were looking at Christmas trees must be a very good mood.
Yeah, most of them. It was New York, you know. Anybody else? Okay, well.
People say when you travel and you take notes or write down what you see or take pictures, you get to live the experience twice. And other people say you don't get to live it at all because you're thinking about it. Would you care to comment on that?
It's kind of like the Robert Bly essay. I think both could be valid, depending on the person. I find for me that one of the main stimuluses for my writing has been being in motion, and being in different places, you know, that just have different things to present to you. I will make a kind of a side comment here, which is that I used to take a lot of photographs. And some years ago, I was at a Tarahumara Indian Holy Week ceremony in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Chihuahua, in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. And I'd been taking some pictures. And at one point, I put my camera down, and I suddenly realized that I'd been compartmentalizing the entire experience. And after I put my camera away, I really started being part of the experience. So there's that. But I think, you know, as a general answer to your question, the more open you are to experiencing things, the more will seep in, and you'll have a richer storehouse from which you can then go back and take from it what you want. That would be my philosophy on it. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you so much. This has really been great. I appreciate you coming and being part of it. It was a real pleasure. Yeah. Anyone is interested, I'll be happy to sign them.
There's a beautiful cover on this book as well. It's a painting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do a lot.